were on this phone call, this video call with Mark Zuckerberg. What was your biggest issue with what he had to say?
We told Mark that those tweets and those posts that the president made actually violated the four corners of their voter suppression policy that's on the books, a policy that we had helped create but actually thought was insufficient and had been working to strengthen. But even on the policy that they have, those tweets violated them. And on the looters and shooters comment, that it violated their policy against incitement to violence. And he disagreed and doubled down on that decision and tried to explain his reasoning. But to us, his reasoning made no sense and actually betrayed a lack of understanding about existing voting rules, the state of voting litigation around the country, and the like. And I think showed why we think it's so important for Mark to have the right people in the room, have civil rights expertise in the room when he was making these decisions.
Now, I understand there was a lot of pushback. Do you feel like he heard you, that he understands your position?
I think he understands our position. I think he disagrees with it. I worry that he has a different view, as I said, about the understanding of what is happening in voting and what the existing voting rules are. But I also think he heard a lot from his own employees this week, who had a lot of things to say about all of this as well. So, he's a smart guy. I think he knows that he understands the positions. I don't think he fully understands voting in America and what the rules are, but I think he believes that this is just a disagreement. What worries me is I think he views this through a partisan lens, as somehow Democrats versus Republicans. But for the civil rights community, this is actually about the voter suppression policies, the nonpartisan efforts that we have built with Facebook pretty painstakingly and over time, that he is not complying with.
Now, how many times have you met with him and Sheryl Sandberg previously, and do you get a sense that his views are changing in a certain direction? Because I understand you've been meeting with them quite frequently.
We have a fair amount of engagement. I would say less with Mark, more with Sheryl, although in the past year, it's been a little bit more with Mark. Our teams at the Leadership Conference and other civil rights groups have been working with the company, as I said, on a range of different issues through the civil rights audit. There have been some things that they've made progress on. We made progress on the fact that they had been allowing for unlawful targeting through their ads, and they stopped doing that, and they settled ongoing litigation. We helped craft at the Leadership Conference their policy to prevent disinformation and interference with the census. It was a pretty robust policy that the company ended up with. We've pressed them at various times around the enforcement of that policy, where they haven't caught major disinformation that they've subsequently taken down after I've had to flag it for them. But so we've had some progress, but I would say on voting in elections, they have moved far too slowly and then have failed to really understand what they are allowing on their platform and the harm that it creates. This isn't about free expression. I worked at the American Civil Liberties Union. I am a fervent defender of free expression and the First Amendment. But the company chose to have community standards. It chose to develop policies after 2016 to fight voter suppression, to fight online hate. And what we are saying, adopt out of what I thought was a sense to, define the values that they want to embody in the world. But by allowing these posts to remain that so clearly violate their own policies, they are undermining the very purpose that they had originally set out with to prevent this kind of manipulation of their platform. And it's very alarming given what we have at stake and the cost it could come with for fair elections in the United States.
Meantime, Twitter has taken a different stand. What do you think about the stand that Twitter has taken? Because obviously they're going to have to make more complicated calls heading into an election and a president who continues to be very vocal.
I mean, we have uplifted Twitter's stand. I think it is really important that Jack Dorsey made the decision that he did to enforce his own standards and take action against the president's tweets, which contained blatant lies about voting methods and procedures, and that were glorifying violence or inciting violence. So Twitter chose a different path. I think it is unfortunate, maybe more than unfortunate, that Mark Zuckerberg criticized Twitter for taking that stance, but they clearly chose and are seeking to define themselves as a company that cares about democracy, and I think is reflected in Twitter's both adoption of these policies, but more importantly, the enforcement of them, even against the President of the United States.
Do you have any concern that the moves that Twitter has taken could inflame the president more and mobilize his base? I mean, it almost, you see the president almost going to battle with social media now, especially with this executive order, and tensions are only going to start running higher.
My view of this is that the companies are choosing to stand up for certain principles when they adopt policies and community standards. And the demand from all of us should be that these companies are consistent in their application of these policies, regardless of whether you're me on the street or you're the President of the United States. And Twitter took action. I think that these issues are only going to get more and more intense. I think that the president is likely to get more and more willing to lie about voting methods and procedures and to seek to suppress voting as he gets more freaked out about the potential of a loss for him. And I think it is incumbent on anyone who cares about fair elections and any company that cares about this, that is it directly got an equity in this, to be consistent with their actions and not create some exception or exemption for the president, who has a really big bully pulpit and can threaten to undermine any ongoing efforts to fight voter suppression on these platforms.
Will you try to meet with Mark Zuckerberg again? I mean, do you have plans for that? Is that in the works?
I think the company is so powerful and has such important sway in our democracy that as frustrated and annoyed as I am, and as much as I would love to walk away, it is too important to our democracy, to our economy, for me to feel responsible about walking away. And so I'm going to continue to push. I hope Facebook employees will continue to push. I think they have a very important and powerful voice. I think there are other kind of people around and stakeholders that need to push harder to make sure that Mark, he's clearly making these decisions himself on some of these really high profile matters, is actually has the right people in the room as he is making them to understand really what is fully at stake and why creating certain special exceptions for the president or anyone else threaten to undermine all of the work that we have tried to do with the company in the last several years.
So when you say he's making the decisions himself, do you get the sense that he's not taking input from people like Sheryl Sandberg?
My sense is he has, Sheryl Sandberg and his policy team in the room, but that policy team and Sheryl, they are not civil rights experts. They don't carry the understanding of what voter suppression looks like, what the voting laws are on the books. Even as to the hate, he doesn't have the civil rights expertise that's also helping to shape his decisions. So they may be providing input, but he is certainly making the final call.
Now, last question. Curfews are lifting across the country. The streets are quieting. What is your call to action? What is next? I mean, this debate over social media shows just how much technology has changed, but also how much the underlying issues of racism and racial injustice have not.
Yeah, so, I think that the Leadership Conference is already working hard in Congress to the legislation that members of Congress are putting together to really address meaningful police reform. Congress takes up this issue so rarely, but I think there's a bigger debate happening right now. While protests may be getting smaller, although I'm not sure if that's true, because it seems like people are actually protesting the law enforcement's and the administration's reactions to the protests through a very militarized approach. But I think that there's now a real conversation to be had about how we actually prioritize interventions in Black and brown communities. City budgets often are much more invested in policing and criminal justice infrastructure than they are in providing healthcare and education and jobs and the kinds of things that show that the health of a community has to be taken into consideration. We aren't going to achieve meaningful police reform just by reforming police departments. So we're going to work in that space and continue to push members of Congress and state and local electeds to do everything they can to have police departments adopt best practices. But I actually think there's a more fundamental kind of question now that I also think COVID-19 there are two pandemics right now that are bringing together, which is how are we actually going to meaningfully address racial inequality and the kinds of priorities that elected officials are making in Black and brown communities, such that we are seeing the kinds of disparities and systemic racism play themselves out not only in policing, but also in healthcare outcomes and in other outcomes that COVID has laid so bare.